right now. I don't think we're actually broadcasting, but you never know with cameras and whatnot. So, and then I got to cut off the sound so it doesn't get a little feedback here. We're definitely up now. Close this out. There we go. All right. Joining us today is Quentin Kidd of the Wason Center at Christopher Newport University. You've just come out with another round of polling, which if you can also detail for us when this was actually done so that we have a better handle on these things, because I saw some movements in there that weren't necessarily center to what the headline said. It's just what geeks like me do when we see polling and just go, oh, good, more data, right? So Quentin Kidd, thanks for joining us today. If you have a question and you're on the Zoom with us, throw it in the chat box. Until then, I'm going to put everyone on mute, and if you could turn your cameras off so we can just have it with Quentin and myself, then we'll open it up so we can do a deeper dive right now. Okay, Quentin, it's all yours.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris, and welcome everybody. And I, welcome questions and comments as we go on. So it's a survey. Unlike some surveys that we've been doing recently, which are horse race, type surveys where we're looking at, partisan identifiers and who they're going to support in upcoming primaries or conventions or elections, we wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the relationship between the ideological orientation of Virginia voters and the partisan orientation of Virginia voters as it related to policy. And we had this survey in the field in March, essentially. It went into the field the very last day of February, and then it was in the field up to the middle of March. But we held it until just before the Republican convention and then the Democratic primary, just because we wanted to provide some context for those races. And since it isn't a horse race survey, since it's more of an ideological larger policy kind of survey, it has a larger shelf life. So we held it for a couple of months to release it right before these conventions, the convention and the primary coming up. So, but the focus is on trying to understand where Virginia voters are ideologically and where they think their ideological opponents are, and then how they understand their own partisans and how they understand the other side's partisans in the context of ideological placement. So we asked things like, on a scale from 0 to 10, where would they place themselves, with 0 being very liberal and 10 being very conservative? And where would you place your ideological opponent, or where would you place, the model Republican or the model Democrat, if you think of it that way? And we gave them the names of some, well-known political figures, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Mitt Romney, Ted Cruz, for example. And we said, where would you place these people on that same ideological scale? And all of this together, trying to understand where Virginians are ideologically just as a group of voters, but also where are self-identified Democrats, where are self-identified Republicans, where do they see themselves? And then how does that relate to policy? And so we used policy questions that were national in scope, simply because those big, broad policy questions are going to get a lot of attention, and they've gotten a lot of attention. And more people probably understand the landscape of big, broad policy questions, for example, related to environmental issues, related to healthcare, related to economic regulation. And what we just sort of top line at what we essentially concluded was that Virginia voters ideologically are sort of right of center. And in my mind, in the quarter century that I've been following Virginia politics, that's sort of where Virginia has been ideologically over the last 25, 50 years, probably slightly right of center. At times it wanders a little bit more right of center. At other times, probably a little bit closer to center. But I've always thought of Virginia as sort of a moderate leaning, slightly to the right state. And that's what we find essentially. However, when we ask people about particular policy proposals, there's a large number of policy proposals that Democrats are advocating for that a majority of Virginia voters say they support. Not all of them, and on sort of basic economic issues, there tends to be a little bit more moderation. But essentially, Virginia ideologically is a slightly right of center state, but it's a slightly right of center state that supports a lot of the policy proposals that Democrats seem to be advocating for right now. That's essentially the top line of it.
Is that top line because that was a lot of the headlines, and you bring out, okay, here's where we are, or here's where Virginians think they are. Maybe that's more of a personal identification. For them, they like to consider themselves. We've often heard the phrase, conservative, fiscally conservative and socially liberal, or socially moderate. However, does that come into that? Because it's a lot of this comes down to when you come to talk about political ideology, it's also political identity.
Sure.
And disidentifying with what you don't like.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit to that. I think you can quickly take that further than it deserves to be. It is a self-placement, ideological self-placement, in part because ideology, like partisan identification, is a fluid thing. Right. Because we don't have party identification or party registration in Virginia, party identification is sort of the way we measure, Republicans and Democratic identifiers. And so, yeah, you ask people where they would place themselves. And they're placing themselves in the aggregate slightly right of center. And so, I haven't done this, but I'm interested in going back. We've been doing polling now, like this, asking this same ideology question for the last 12 years in our polling. So I'm interested in going back and looking at sort of the longitudinal trend line of that ideology. But having looked at all that data over the years as we collected it, my sense is that Virginia has been a moderate, slightly right of the middle state, literally for the last 10 or 12 years that we've been looking at it.
Well, that's a fascinating piece, because so much has changed in our country politically over the last 12, 15 years with the Iraq-Afghan wars, with the collapse of the economy, with TARP, the bailouts, the rise of Donald Trump. And there's this continuity to Virginia, even though Virginia is changing dramatically. We're adding new voters, we're losing voters, people are coming in from frankly all corners of the world to come to Virginia, and yet we remain sort of on that same path. What do you attribute that to?
I attribute it to, I don't, that's a good question. I don't know that I don't know that I can concrete attribute it to anything.
Your gut feel, what's your gut feel on this?
Yeah, my gut feeling is that look, there's a political scientist named V.O. Key who wrote, the canonical book in Southern Politics, Southern Politics and State and Nation. And in his chapter on Virginia, he talked about the governor of Virginia is the curator of the political museum. And you just stop and think about that for a moment. It suggests that Virginia changes very slowly. And I think if we're looking at a decade's worth of ideological self-placement data, and we don't see a lot of movement, although I think we may see, slight movement, here and there, it suggests that Virginia is what Virginia has largely been for a long time, which is a slowly evolving state that doesn't like rapid change, much, and people are pretty moderate, politically pretty moderate, and I think that would be consistent with Virginia's history. Certainly, V.O. Key was writing about Virginia back in the 40s and 50s, and so 1940s and 50s, and so it would be pretty consistent with Virginia, I think.
Is it is it Goldilocks? This is just right. This is like the bed's not too soft, the bed's not too hard. This is just right. We have 4 seasons. We're close to the federal government. Things don't change that quickly up there. Where our economy is locked into it. There's a lot of geography involved in this, but it's also cultural to a degree. But a lot of that culture stems from the fact, at least politically, that we have elections that are off years. And so there's always this test of the national swing to the other way. And so we sort of recalibrate the national dynamic that I think we're picking up here in part of your polling.
I think there's a lot to that. If you leave aside the Trump elections, the election in 2016, the elections right after Donald Trump, where partisan differences seem to be amplified, Democrats were really energized post 2016. There has always been a slight difference in Democrat over, since Democrats started doing well in statewide elections since 2009. There's always been a slight difference between federal level Democratic voting and state level Democratic voting. So I do think there's a corrective nature, may not be the right way to describe it, but it's sort of a corrective, if you will, in the sense of the off year elections. I think there's other things that go along with this. Virginia doesn't have massively big cities, and massively big cities is where you're going to get really large concentrations of big, loud, progressive voices and big groups of progressive voters that can swing public perception on issues. Virginia has small to medium-sized cities, and they produce a slightly different kind of, a slightly different kind of progressive politics. You see progressive politics emerging in Virginia, but it's emerging in the context of not a Philadelphia or a New York City or something like that. It's emerging in the context of literally a Richmond, a Roanoke, places like that. And so when you get the smaller cities and the progressive politics, you get a different kind of progressive politics, a politics that may say, look, ideologically, I'm pretty moderate, but there are things that I'm going to support that look really progressive. And I think that it's all of that, I think, in there.
Well, I think we saw that borne out in the Medicaid expansion debate, didn't we? It was delayed until the conservative reforms that Kirk Cox and Emmett Hanger and Chris Jones accepted and worked with Governor Ralph Northam on. That got them over the hump. Like, at least we're getting something out of the deal. They could wait for that possibility, knowing that they didn't have the votes to stop full expansion. They got a lot out of the deal. Now, that deal wasn't upheld, unfortunately, at least from a political context or a policy context. But the reality was, there's always going to be that balance somewhere in Virginia that they seem to strike, isn't there? When Bob McDonnell said, and maybe it's the single term executive that the governor says, look, we're going to get something done. We don't have to delay this and build up this pressure to get something done, and it becomes overblown when it finally passes. Governor McDonnell passed the big increase for road funding, transportation funding, and certainly didn't run on that. Most Republicans wouldn't, but he realized that this was going to be a legacy move for him. And in his final term, his final session is when he got it done, which was extraordinary. And I think that might be part of the single term executive influence, that a governor comes in, gets as much done as he can, but he can't swing the wheel too widely.
Right. And what it also means is that every election is a discrete election. It's not a continuation of a political battle. If a governor can't run for re-election, then what the governor did or didn't do can't be too centrally a part of the agenda of either side's campaign. And I would also say, if you look at the makeup of the General Assembly, the House and the Senate right now, it is Democratic by small margins, by small majorities. And I think if the Commonwealth really is sort of ideologically median, slightly right of center by a small percentage, if you account for the energized Democratic base since 2016, I think you understand why the Democrats have a slight majority in the House and the Senate, but why Republicans, are feeling like there's an opportunity to take back the House. Like they've identified their 7 or 8, 9 delegates districts around the state in the sort of suburban Richmond, suburban Hampton Roads area that they're going to target and try to take it back. That reflects a pretty ideologically balanced state where both parties are going to really slug it out to try to win each house of the General Assembly. Democrats have done really well in statewide races, I think, because since 2009, Democrats have been much more focused on offering practical policy solutions to voters, and Republicans have not been. I think
that's right. You didn't ask a lot of issues in your survey on what Republicans actually want, because frankly, I think they left the battlefield of ideas back in the 90s. I mean, that just sort of followed up their all the what their agenda was, and you looked around and their guns were empty. And the Democrats said, "Hey, we've got these ideas too." It's sort of a calibration in the marketplace, and they started fulfilling them, and they started to get some momentum. And they're pushing an agenda. Republicans right now in Virginia, I don't think have an agenda.
I don't think they have had a concerted policy agenda since 2009.
That's what I mean.
And I've reminded people the last couple of days, the last time a Republican won statewide, Bob McDonald was running on practical policy solutions to concerns about a weak economy. And Bob's for Jobs was really attractive to voters, especially suburban voters who, quite frankly, aren't hardcore Democrats or hardcore Republicans. They're hardcore having government do what government is supposed to do and not much more. And one could say, look, if Republicans, whoever the Republican slate of candidates is in the fall, could offer a set of really practical solutions to voters, and make the argument that Democrats may have gone to, are out over their skis a little bit, that may be a really effective argument to suburban voters who, quite frankly, don't really care what party's in power. They just want good schools, safe streets that don't have a lot of potholes in them. They want to be able to get to their offices or wherever they work in a reasonable amount of time, without having to deal with a lot of traffic.
Yeah, that's not rocket science for suburban. Having moved from rural Virginia to suburban Virginia, the politics are very different because the culture and the life is very different. I remember when we first got here, our delegate kept sending us letters on guns. I'm like, man, this is just not an issue in this neighborhood, and I couldn't understand, but that's just the list he was working off of, but it wasn't the reality of why we moved here in the first place. It was economics, it was schools, it was proximity to to basically capital, if you will, the state capital or the financial capital. But people move to suburbs for very different reasons than they move to rural America or stay in rural America. And as a result, the politics are quite reflective of that. Quentin, let's take a quick dive here in some of the issues. You mentioned the springback, if you will. I don't think you actually said the word springback, and I want to put words in, but earlier in the year, Democrats had a 12-point edge. Now they're down to 2. What do you make of that?
In 12-point edge to
party of preference, it was 44-42 in your most recent one, and in the last one it was 47-35, I think.
Some of that may have to do with whether it's a registered voter survey or a likely voter survey, and so I think you got to be careful about comparing apples and oranges. So what we do here is registered voters.
They're your apples and oranges. So
So I'm uncomfortable comparing a registered voter survey to a likely voter survey, because a registered voter survey and a likely voter survey are likely to produce different party identification.
So which was the one
percentages?
Which was the one in February? And which one was the one in March?
The one we just put out was a registered voter survey. So it's registered. Any registered voter in Virginia could participate, was eligible in the random draw. And
so the first one was likely in February?
I guess I don't know exactly what survey you're talking about.
Well, I compared your the one that you put out in February that you said was early February polling and then early March polling.
So is this the survey in February on the General Assembly?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, I'd have to be.
I looked at the party ideologies and the leans, and I just saw a shift occurring in your polling, and it wasn't a subtle shift. It wasn't statistically insignificant. It was a not so subtle shift. It was the center right. First it was center right, center left, and then back in February it was 47-42, and now it's 50-42 center right, center left. And that stands out ideologically. That's a not so subtle shift away from center left politics and reflection of, the Biden administration and the reaction to it. But it's also the fact that your 12-point advantage for Democrats was very consistent with what happened in November. And because it was consistent with November, the Trump phenomenon didn't end until the end of January, after all the January 6th crap, and then finally the inauguration, then the move into the policies that the Biden administration put forward. So there's that shifting I saw in the party ideology, self-identification that I think is reflective of how Virginia truly behaves.
Yeah, I would say this generally about party identification. It is fluid to an extent. I mean, there's a core, I've always said a third. I mean, I realize that's a generalization, sometimes more gross generalization than at other times, but generally speaking, I always think of it as a third. But depending on which party is in power in Washington and in Richmond, and which party, how dramatic the politics are in any situation, you're going to get fluctuations in D and R identifying or leaning, D and R leaning. And so I do think to a certain extent it's a reflection of who's in power, and people reacting to that. But there's also, in any given survey, there's a 2 or 3 percentage points of variability on either side of the mean that you have to account for as well. So if somebody says, in one survey, your R identifiers was, 45, and in the other survey it moved to 50. Part of that is going to be is explainable by, the margin of error variations. Part of it could be explainable by some event that happened that caused people to identify or move their identifications in some way or the other.
Well, and that's there's not so subtle shifts, and then there's subtle shifts. And for me, I looked at February, it was when you threw in leaning Democrats and leaning Republicans, it was 49 Democrat, 37 Republican. The brand for Republicans was awful then. And then independents, who were the third, a little over half of them decided, and they went 50 and stuck with 15. Today, it's 44 for Democrats, 42 for Republicans, and 11 for independents. And that's, again, those are marginal shifts, but those margins have added up to a 10-point overall shift for Republicans. And it's all, for me, it stood out as, and I've been saying, look for status quo ante 2015 before Donald Trump entered the stage on June 15th down the escalator at Trump Tower. And, I don't know if that's actually occurring or the antipathy for Donald Trump is still vibrant, but I think it's got to be calculated into a lot of campaign polling coming out.
Yeah, probably. I would also say, I think post January, the Republican campaigns really started to pick up in terms of their outreach. And I do think that actually helps a Republican identification in Virginia. And I think Republicans had sort of backed off into the shadows a little bit in the latter months of the Trump administration, especially as it rolled into late January. And then when late January rolled over, Republican campaigns in Virginia started picking up. I do think that helps identification, especially in the context of the fluid nature of identification.
Yeah, so let's do, again, joining us, Quentin Kidd from Christopher Newport University's Wason Center. If you have a question, throw it in the chat box. Nothing's there just yet. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Quentin, I know how much time you have. I don't want to take up too much of yours, but I always appreciate your take on these things and your polling. When you look at where the two parties identify themselves versus their reality, where do they see themselves?
I think both parties as groups see themselves as more moderate than the general population sees them, or the opposite partisan sees them. The swing occurs a little bit more strongly on the R side. So Republicans see themselves as more moderate than Virginia voters generally see Republicans, and Republicans see themselves as more moderate than Democrats see the Republicans. So both general voters and Democrats identified Republicans further to the right than general voters and Republicans identified Democrats further to the left by, a small amount. Okay. So, and by the way, that doesn't that doesn't surprise me, in part because if you just think of, when you ask voters generally sort of place Republicans somewhere, they've got to think of a reason or a sort of a cognitive cue about how to place Republicans. And if they're thinking in the context of Virginia, they're thinking of candidates that were further to the right, E.W. Jackson's, Ken Cuccinelli's. They're thinking of, Donald Trump's and people like that. Right. And so it doesn't really surprise me. It isn't radically, different for each other.
So no big surprises in
but in general, both partisans groups see themselves as more moderate than their partisan opponents see them, or than the general population sees them. Right. And that shouldn't surprise anybody.
No, of course not. But what I've often seen and been very consistent in your polling is how people identify as being a strong liberal, moderate to liberal, moderate to conservative, strong conservative. And it's correct me if I'm wrong, but your polling shows that Virginia Republicans are further to the right than the Democrats are to the left.
There is a stronger group of strong conservative, leaning conservatives in Virginia than there are strong liberals, leaning liberals in Virginia. Again, I think that has to do with the suburban, rural nature of Virginia as opposed to the urban, suburban, rural nature of Virginia. We just don't have big urban, cities. And I think where you get those big chunks of, strong liberal groups is in big urban areas. And given that Virginia just has a set of, smaller cities. I mean, the biggest city in Virginia Beach, is essentially a big suburb. And so it doesn't think of itself as an urban city of 500,000 people. It's really a suburban city of 500,000 people.
And that's why it's, a mix politically. I mean, it tends to vote Republican.
Hey, Chris, this is Joel Rubin. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're good, Joel. We'll get back to you in a second. We'll open it up in a second. Throw a question in the chat box here if you can. I was going to keep the conversation going here. Let's dive into some of these issue sets if we can. The time that we have, healthcare. We discussed. You discussed and polled on healthcare, Medicare for all, and and private health insurance. Where do you see Virginians trending on health care policy?
Virginians are trending. I don't know if trending is the right way to say it, because we asked this as a moment in time. Right now, Virginians support this Medicaid for all, healthcare for all who want it proposal, and I think in part that's because, if you struggle with healthcare, if you struggle with access to healthcare, paying for healthcare, and you've got one set of policy options on the table, and you don't have another set of alternative policy options on the table, you're going to take the policy options that are available to you. And so I'm not surprised to see the data the way it is, because while you see a partisan difference, you see Republican identifiers say they support, cutting Obamacare or replacing it with something. It's the something that is the big black hole. So again,
it's been half a generation. They still haven't come up with a plan.
Right. And so I think, again, this speaks to the challenge that Republicans have, I think, which is offer an alternative and argue the alternative. And you're likely to, Republicans are likely to pick up support for that alternative. But if there is no alternative except a concept against an alternative, I think voters, again, the big sort of middle of voters who don't really care which party's in power, they just want solutions to problems, are going to take the solution to the problem that's available. I think it's too simplistic to say, sure, people want free stuff. I think you're the one who said that. I think that's too simplistic. It isn't that people want free stuff. People want solutions to problems, and the two parties are supposed to offer their solutions to problems and let voters and make the case to voters, and the party that makes the best case and makes the most sense to voters is going to win. I think on a lot of these big policy questions right now, Republicans aren't offering a policy alternative.
Without question, that's been one of my biggest bugaboos with the party for the last almost 15, 20 years, that you have to have a credible alternative to saying no. You just can't be a party of no. And, when I made when I was being sarcastic about, Virginia's centrist but likes free stuff, the fact of the matter is Republicans haven't pointed out what these things cost. So when you say, when someone says, hey, we're going to raise the minimum wage, and they go, oh, we're opposed to that, they don't go, we're going to lose jobs, or here's the downside to this, so you can have a balanced opinion on what the actual issue is. So because Democrats have been pounding the $15 minimum wage and pounding it, and after a while people go, well, what's the downside? Because we don't hear any downside. We just hear no, no, no. It's like the whole tax thing back in the mid-aughts. Oh, we're opposed to taxes. We're opposed to taxes and Medicaid expansion. Oh, it's the advancement of Obamacare. I mean, are you really that upset that poor people are getting health care? I mean, what are you really upset about here? Because if you don't come up with something, to your point, we only have what's available to us to make a decision on, and this seems to be a little bit more well thought out, and it's not going to hurt me that much. So it doesn't impact me in a cost basis. It's like real estate taxes. You don't see your real estate taxes go up because it's escrowed in your mortgage account. Okay, people don't get that upset about gas taxes. Why? They don't see it.
Right.
So it comes across as, oh, I didn't pay for these new roads. You paid a lot of money for these new roads, but you don't see it. And that was sort of my not so scripted point there. You don't.
I understood.
Well, I don't think everybody else did. It's not free. I'm like, I'm just trying to poke some eyes. Environmental policy.
You do see some alternatives.
What's that?
I said you do see some alternatives like energy and environmental policy, right? I mean, you hear Republicans saying, expand exploration for offshore oil and things like that, and you see support for that. Yeah, in the polling,
it's something, right? It's lower gas prices. It's and that's been abandoned because the market's just not there anymore. No one's going to drill offshore. Not that the administration wouldn't allow it. It's just not economically feasible. Immigration policy. Virginians seem to be fairly well in line with the rest of the country here.
Yeah, but again, you do also see support for the Republican alternative. Here's a policy area where Republicans have an alternative. Spend money on enforcement. Build barriers to keep illegal immigration out. You can say what you want about, and this is what the party should be doing. The party should be debating each other on these policies. But Republicans have a policy there that they're advocating for, and you see uptick in support for it in the polling because there is an alternative.
Yeah, that's one of the things that you won't lose by offering an alternative. The problem for Republicans to get trapped in is they can't even work with Democrats to come up with a compromise or a solution, because then they're turncoats, rhinos, whatever the term du jour is for Republicans, and they get caught by their own ideological spectrum. And not allowing any compromise. And we have a question here from Joel Rubin asking, talk about the Trump factor. He's not in office or on the ballot. Is he gone finally from the ballot, do you think?
I think there's a lingering hangover. My sense is there's a lingering hangover in Virginia. The extent to which that hangover lasts longer or shorter is driven by a couple of things. I think who Republicans nominate. Who knows what's going to happen on Saturday or whenever we know post Saturday. But if Amanda Chase happens to come out on top, then there clearly is a Trump effect that's at play in Virginia. If she doesn't, and she goes back to Chesterfield County and becomes a good state senator engaged in constituency service, and we don't hear a lot about her from on the statewide level, then it probably goes away a little bit more. So I think it depends on who Republicans nominate and how much they're going to make Trump and the issues that Trump, not issues, but the sort of narrative of Trump a part of their campaign. And so I think it all depends, but clearly he's still around.
Right.
He's still there. It's a real outstanding question as to what role he plays in the fall. And I imagine that, if Democrats need to, they're going to try to make him play a bigger role than he might otherwise. And so that'll be the sort of narrative give and take in the fall.
Yeah, I looked at the 2016 primaries. Trump was around 35%, Rubio at 32%. And if Amanda Chase and Pete Snyder, who, Pete Snyder didn't say he's Trump too, but he brought in his immigration team and got all these endorsements from the Trump folks. If they split up the Trump vote and it's 25-10 or 18-17 and a little left over here and there, there's a really big lane for a Glenn Youngkin to come in with the Marco Rubio vote at 32, combining with Ted Cruz. I think that's how you get to the majority. If you're trying to find those, not necessarily those brands, but those lanes of how Republicans view themselves ideologically, or at least how they want to be seen in the electorate.
Right, and to make matters even more complicated, it's the ranked choice, ballot. So if you're a Rubio voter, if you're in that Rubio lane, who is your number two? Are you willing to move over into the Trump lane for number two? Or if you're in the Trump lane, are you willing to move out of the Trump lane? Let's say you're an Amanda Chase 1 in the Trump lane. Are you a Pete Snyder 2? Or are you going to move out of the Trump lane for a Kurt Cox or a Glenn Youngkin as number 2? And that's a real outstanding question to me.
Yeah, the fact that the Republicans are testing this out in their nomination and frankly, a winnable gubernatorial election, it was stunning that they've come up with this format almost by default. They sort of backed themselves into it. And it's really, I think it's proving ranked choice voting to be successful. I like the early results and the fact that, there's been some negative campaigning, but there's also people going, hey, this other guy's not so bad. Hey, vote for me for number 2. There's this other element of campaigning that I think could have a very positive effect on our politics. What do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say one of the big arguments for ranked choice voting. There's several arguments for it, but one of them is that it will make an election less dirty. And we have seen certainly elements of that. We've seen the candidates essentially come out and praising their opponents, which you would never see in a straight up primary. But we've also still seen some of that negative, campaigning going on, especially, down some of the down ballot races. So we'll see. Let's see how well the execution of the counting of the ballots plays out before we sing the praises of. Now, ranked choice voting can work really well. It's used in a lot of places. Let's just see how well it's executed here. What can go
wrong, Quentin? The Republicans are running it.
I'm still hesitant. I don't want to come out of Saturday or a week from Saturday and everyone scratch their heads and say the Iowa caucuses were run like a well-oiled machine compared to this. That would be a horrible analysis to come out with.
Well, that's what we're looking at so far. But I was interested that a lot of the attacks, though, the more scurrilous, dirty, negative, awful attacks, were done basically anonymously.
Yeah, because in a ranked choice situation,
right,
you can't take credit.
Right.
Because every hit on your opponent that your opponent's supporters perceive as unfair is essentially a hit on your opportunity to be their second choice. And so that's partly why I think that's a large degree why we've seen those hits be anonymous.
Well, let's talk bipartisanship, because that's one of the things that Virginia Free has been known for over the years, nonpartisanship. Where is an area in policy that the Republicans and Democrats can be nudged to work together on successfully?
There are probably lots. I mean, if you're thinking about national politics or state politics, there are a lot of areas where I think the parties can work together if they can get beyond a fear of their base. That's a big fear to get beyond. But look, if you talk to, let's just take national politics for a moment, just because it's easy to think about it this way. But there's support on both sides for immigration reform. There's massive support on both sides for infrastructure, work on infrastructure. There's largely still that sort of, politics stops at the border, bipartisan support for foreign policy. I mean, both sides think that we ought to be whacking China over the head more than we are. But neither side can seem to get beyond its base or a fear of its base to sort of work together. And I think part of that is a structural issue. Part of that is just sort of the dynamic of our politics right now. This is going to sound really weird, probably, and not something that fiscal conservatives are going to really like. But, bringing back pork barrel politics might help, because, legislative politics is about scratching each other's backs, and that does help people work together across party lines. There are very few states. I don't think there is a state right now that is represented by all one party at the congressional level. And so in order to get things done to support a state or a district, a lot of times you have to work across party lines. We see it in Hampton Roads all the time. Rob Whitman and Bobby Scott work together all the time on military issues, on shipbuilding issues. So we see it. It's probably there more than we realize, but it's not there as much as it should be.
No, and I remember I did a TV show with a congressman from Chicago. We were off mic and just waiting to come on air, and he goes, one of the problems in this town is when they got rid of earmarks, because you couldn't do the wheeling and dealing and getting to know people. It was either yes or no, and our team puts their big package together and they win this year, and if they lose the election, it goes to the other team the next year, and we don't work with each other. They literally don't know each other, and we can't expect them to work and get something done if they fundamentally don't even recognize each other and know that there's a human being behind the name.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of bringing earmarks back. Again, I know fiscal conservatives will hate that, and budget hawks will hate that.
Let's back it up. Are there any fiscal conservatives left after the Trump administration? Let's be honest.
The point I was going to get at is, the sort of fiscal conservatism of the sort of 80s that Reagan ushered in is sort of gone. We don't have that anymore. And so if we're not going to have fiscally conservative legislative politics, then let's bring back something that helps the parties work together, because budget deficits haven't gone down in the last couple of decades.
Oh God, no! That was part of my point. And we're centrist, but we like free stuff. Is that it's free if it's on the credit card and you never pay the credit card off. And that was what came out of the Iraq-Afghanistan wars. We weren't going to pay for this. We'll let the next generation pay for it. This is just the direction we've gone. It's okay if we put it on the credit card and no one sees it, no one gets the bill. Therefore, who pays for it? It's just not there. Let's open up. Anyone got any questions? Been a great conversation. Quentin, thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and your obviously your work at the Wason Center. Anything you want to plug in the future coming up?
We're going to do more polling.
When's your next poll coming out?
Well, we've done a little bit of a dive on environmental issues in Virginia that we're going to put out, and then so our labor pool is our students. We have our makeup 2020 graduation on Saturday, and the next Saturday we have our 2021 graduation, and then our students go home for the summer. So when they come back in late August, we'll crank up the polling again just in time for the election season. So we'll be off in the summer unless something pops up and we think we need to do some polling to help sort of, help the conversation be understood a little bit more. And then we would do something where we hired out the calling part of it.
Okay. And then so you'll it sounds like you do a benchmark environmental poll coming up, and then you'll be doing the head-to-head matchups starting late August, early September. And how often those are going to roll out? Every 2 or 3 weeks? Every 2 or 3 weeks.
We'll, when the students come back, we start rolling basically nonstop. They work, 6 days a week, 6 evenings a week, and then most of the day on Sunday, calling Virginians and asking their opinions.
Okay, let me check the chat box one more time. Nothing in there. Last round for calls, folks. I'll take you off mute if you want. You don't have to. It's just a courtesy because you've been invited to join. Appreciate everyone joining on the call here. It's on short notice, but because I wanted to get Quentin on here before the convention this weekend to get a sense of where things were going into the convention. And obviously, if the Republicans did nominate Chase, it's done. Then I'll see a path forward for Republicans to win the governor's mansion back. I think Youngkin and Cox make a good run at it, and Pete probably less so. It's just my sense of how this thing's going to play out because he might get a third-party challenge. But what's your sense of that so far?
Yeah, I just think Chase has a real ceiling, and that ceiling is probably a good, a healthy third, but not much more than a healthy third. And I think that ceiling is the same in the Republican primary as it would be in the general election.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the real problem with Chase. Kurt Cox is a known quantity in Republican politics. He's, in my mind, if you leave aside the campaigning Kurt Cox, the Kurt Cox pre-running for governor is sort of a classic social conservative Republican. I mean, and I think most Republicans in Virginia could look at that and identify with that. And then you get the Snyders and the Youngkins who are come out of an entrepreneurial wing of Republicanism, sort of a free market entrepreneurial wing of Republicanism that probably, if they're being honest with you in a room with no recorders, would say on social issues, we really don't care much about, social issues, but we have to, on the campaign trail. So, and I don't, of the candidate. So Republicans have been making a big deal of some things. I've begun to think this is a sophisticated campaign strategy, whether it's intentional or not. And that is this: the Republicans have beaten the governor up over vaccine rollout. The Republicans have beaten up the governor and officials over schools reopening, things like that. None of those issues are going to be live issues in the fall.
Right.
They're just not. The schools are going to be open. Most people who want the vaccine have been able to get the vaccine. Right. And so what that means is that whoever the Republican nominee is, unless it's Amanda Chase, is sort of free to grab issues that are live and important to voters at that time. Right. So it allows the Republican nominee to essentially reset for the fall without having the baggage of positions that they've got to account for in the spring, because those issues will be gone. And so it's either totally brilliant or totally unintentional, but brilliant by accident.
It might just be the ebb and flow of politics here in Virginia. We do have a question from Bruce Jennings. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah,
hey, Bruce.
Should I put my video on or not, or just
your call? Your call.
Okay, I'll put it on.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, sir. It's good to see you, Quentin, and I look forward to seeing you Saturday down there.
Yep.
I guess you attribute the move from the left to the right, or the Democrats losing ground to the Republicans over the incoming and Biden administration's policies. Would that be correct?
Yeah, there's an ebb and a flow, and I think the ebb has probably been, or the flow, however you want to think about it, has probably been less dramatic than it certainly is less dramatic than it was in 2017 when the new President Trump came into office, in part because Biden is, much more moderate in his presentation. And so I think it's a less dramatic, nevertheless, it's there. And I think you're going to continue to see, I think this is what Chris was picking up on. You're going to continue to see that because a president comes in to office normally, again, we have to sort of hold Trump aside. Normally a president comes into office and they have a reservoir of goodwill, and they spend that reservoir out over a certain amount of time. We have come to attribute the first 100 days as sort of spending out that reservoir. And at the end of the first 100 days, they've sort of spent their reservoir. And from there on, it's sort of, they can only spend what they can collect. I think that has essentially worked for Biden. And because he's so moderate relative to Trump, you see the swing a little bit less dramatically, but you still see it. And I think you're going to still continue to see it. And the question for me is, in the fall, is the Democratic nominee weighed down by Biden and the Biden administration as much as the Republican nominee was weighed down 4 years ago by Trump, the Trump administration? And my gut tells me they're not going to be as weighed down as heavily, in part because the contrast from Biden to Trump is so dramatic.
Quentin, is that contrast primarily personality? Is it bombast versus boring?
It is stylistic, I think.
Yeah, the policy agenda that Biden's come out, it is not moderate.
That's right.
This is not like, oh, we're going to pay for the pandemic now. They're like, well, we're still going to have that on the credit card, but we're going to load this puppy up or try to. Anyway.
Yeah, no, this is trillions of dollars worth of policy that has been proposed. I mean, it's a big policy agenda, but it's stylistic. It's a stylistic contrast, and it's the pandemic. I mean, getting the pandemic under control, vaccinating people, et cetera. I think it's a combination of those two things. Because on policy, the Trump administration was pursuing, if you could sort of, with a little bit of space and time, we can see that the Trump administration was pursuing a very federalist policy approach. Right. You really saw that in the pandemic. Their approach to the pandemic was very federalist. And you see a much more centralized policy approach of the Biden administration. And so there's great contrast in policy. It sort of gets hidden by the massive contrast in style.
Right. Yeah. I think that the photo op yesterday for Biden was carrying out some pastries from a bakery or something, and he was just being a regular everyday Joe, like he was going to the store. And I'm like, okay, that's a great play, versus tweeting and getting out there and stirring it all up. He's just putting a grandpa dad feel on this thing versus what Trump brought every day in chaos there.
Yeah. Think about the last 3 or 4 days of photo days for Biden, coming out of the small business with his, pastries, stopping on the side of the road to say hi to a little kid in Yorktown, stopping to pick up a flower out of the White House lawn for, the first lady. That's the kind of stylistic stuff that, quite frankly, those suburban voters who don't really care which party you are a part of really like, and they don't really like the bombastic tweeting and the confrontation. So again, it's the stylistic differences are crazy.
And you look at it, you're like, okay, it's because people aren't paying that close attention to it anymore. And when they glance at it, they see the picture of Biden, and that's the photo shot for the day. He's picking up a flower. I mean, it could have been scripted, it could have not been scripted, but who cares? That's the image that's going into it. And then people attack him for like, oh, what are you attacking him for? It's like inviting the attack on some guy picking a flower for his wife is just so easy these days. It's like catnip for Republicans.
Right.
Anyway.
I know business people are absolutely scared to death by these tax proposals to pay for all this policy spending he's talking about. But I don't know how heavily that weighs in the election. Not everybody's in business for themselves, So.
Well, and I've had some interviews with several national outlets, and because we were talking about menthol cigarette ban and how it might adversely impact the black, a certain part of the black vote, not all the black vote, but some of the black vote, in a lower turnout election that can matter in certain districts. It could really matter a lot. But and I said, but also Trump tapped into higher black turnout for him and higher Hispanic turnout. But what ran away from him were wealthy suburban voters who just culturally couldn't stand the guy. And now they're back in the crosshairs of the tax increases that you're talking about and the SALT deduction. Those kinds of things I aggregate, and what can happen is they might not show up and vote for Republican, but they're not going to show up and vote for a Democrat as much as they used to. And I think that might be borne out in some of Quentin's polling. Quentin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're going to see if that's the case, assuming Democrat or Republicans don't nominate somebody like a Chase, we should see that effect emerging on the margins of the races this year in Virginia. And this is partly why Virginia is a good bellwether for the next round of midterm elections, because we should see some of that stuff emerging on the margins. We should see it emerging in polling, if that's going to happen. And I think it's more likely to happen, quite frankly, if you nominate somebody like a Youngkin or a Snyder. I think they can make those cases a little bit easier simply because they come out of a business background. I think Cox could make the case, but I don't think Chase could make the case, because I don't think she can get out from her where she is ideologically and politically to make the case. And I don't think she can shed the baggage to make the case.
No, and she'll get a third-party challenge anyway. I mean, it's just
thank you, but thank you.
Pretty much there. Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Congressman Riggleman's pretty much there 100%. If Chase is the nominee, he'll jump in. And he's told me that directly. He said I don't have to keep that off the record, so it is what it is. Last call for questions here. Quentin, thank you so much for your time. Look forward to having you back on if you're of mind to do that. But I want to make sure we got you on here and talk about your poll before the Republican nomination begins on Saturday. God knows when it's going to end. Hopefully before the election in November, huh? We'll see who the nominee is going to be. Anyway.
7,000 voters in Fairfax County for one location for a few hours.
Come on.
It's a logistical nightmare.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Republican Party of Virginia.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Quentin. Thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed.